So we talked a little bit in our last video about what is bias and how can it affect the things we do in the world. This video is a little similar. This time I want to focus on ethics. What have people started to put together as something of a solution to this problem? What is the perspective on ethics in the world today? And what can you do to make sure that your visualizations are not intentionally or unintentionally unethical? There's a really wonderful story on a podcast called Reply All. The episode name is The Crime Machine, and it talks about the unintended consequences of data visualization in the specific perspective of the New York Police Department. Brief trigger warning before I get into the details of this story. This will unfortunately necessarily discuss policing and sexual violence. There was this guy, Jack Maple, a cop and a visionary and a technologist. There's a quote from him here. He said, "I called them the charts of the future. On 55 feet of wall space, I mapped every train station in the city and every train. Then I used crayons to mark every violent crime, every robbery, every grand larceny that occurred. I mapped the solved versus the unsolved." This is kind of the first major foray into what is now called crime mapping, an attempt by police departments to use data visualization to figure out what they might be missing, to catch specific criminals, but also to observe patterns of how crime changed. It was a great idea. It was a really useful project. Because of this and because of many other things, crime went down massively. Well, it's really difficult to say if that's correlation or a causal relationship. But what it was designed to do is allow the overall New York Police Department to put pressure on the commissioners of specific districts, of specific neighborhoods, and get them to reduce crime in particular areas when they were experiencing more of that particular kind of crime than other districts in the area. And that's where things started to go wrong. This is told in much more detail by the excellent folks at Reply All, so go listen to them, not me. But effectively what happened is that there became a huge amount of pressure that filtered down from the crime mapping people into the commissioners, down into the beat cops, to underreport crimes. There are stories in that episode of people who were raped being told by the police not to report that as rape and instead to report it as a lesser crime. Why? To reduce the number of reported rapes in that area. So we know, looking at these things, that the best of intentions, the best of visualizations can have unintended consequences. And what does it mean to try to work around that? What does it mean to try and do good design anyway? Well, we can start with what are people saying around the world about how to be ethical with data. This is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this is a UN document that outlines the rights that all humans have. Freedom is the right of all sentient beings and all that stuff. And this says, no one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with with their privacy, family, home, or correspondence, nor to attacks upon their honor and reputation. The UDHR is quite old. We will perhaps, in this instance, forgive the gendering. Well, that's a good start. Everyone should have the right to privacy. Here's one from the EU. This is the General Data... Let me just look up what that is exactly. Everyone talks about it as the Gdpr. And that stands for the General Data Protection Regulation. I know things. I can Google things. Unless a data subject has provided informed consent, personal data may not be processed unless there is at least one legal basis for doing so. It then goes on to outline a bunch of legal bases, like in the process of completing a contract and various things like that. In defining this legislation as you can only use it for one of these explicit purposes, it means you can't use it for stuff like marketing-related products. You explicitly cannot use the data for that without obtaining specific consent. So there's a bunch of issues that arise in data use. I just want to go through a couple of them. The first and most obvious one, and the one that we deal with the most as universities dealing with research on students, on people in the world, is identifiability. Given the data you've got, can you figure out who it is? That's a first test. If you can figure out who someone is, then any of the data you've collected might as well be publicly linked to their identity. And sometimes you really, really don't want to be doing that. Second issue is who owns these digital traces? Because it may be data about you, but it's actually data about you using a commercial platform in many instances. It's data about you encountering the services or products of some other company. And so they may sort of rightfully conclude that that is theirs. So how do we navigate if it's about you? Is it yours? Should you have access to it? Do we want to live in a world where you do? And do we want to live in a world where you don't? What do you consent to? In signing a license agreement to use a product, you almost always consent to them collecting data about your use, but can they reuse it? Can they take that data and without asking for your consent again and without your knowledge, can they use it for some other purpose? We talked in the last video about the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Well, that was all about data reuse. So they collected it by doing a dopey little quiz on Facebook, collected all sorts of information about you and your friends and your behavior and your beliefs, and they just packaged it up and sold it to political campaigns. You may have consented to getting the dopey quiz answer, but you never consented to it being used to help elect Donald Trump. Then there's the question of rectifiability. Is it your right to fix incorrect data? So this is something that has been long a piece of legislation when it comes to credit records. You may or may not be aware, but that in many countries, there is a central repository of whether you tend to repay your debts, and your credit record can be improved by acquiring debt and then paying it off, not by never acquiring debt. Remember, you have often a bad credit record if you never take on debt. You pay for everything up front. You've got a terrible record in the United States. I ran into that problem when I moved there. I wasn't eligible for a credit card because I'd never had any debt. Never had any debt on US soil, I mean. Separate story. Then is the right, do you have the right to erase data that's no longer true? This is something that the trans community has to deal with quite a lot. There are records of you with a dead name out on the internet. What do you have the right to do with that as it relates to an officially changed identity? One really, really good source on this stuff, if you're at all interested in these questions about how data is changing the world, the political world, the commercial world, I really recommend you read Jamie Suskind's Future Politics. He came and gave a talk here at the university in 2019. Amazing guy, very articulate, just a funny writer as well. He takes what are fairly grim topics about how our machines are eating our world, and has just this really readable, erudite, but approachable voice. This is my source on a lot of this stuff, and I think he's quite prescient about how it will continue to affect the notion of power and the notion of nations. He says this really nice quote, talking about these three different ways that he's outlined that you can influence someone. You can influence someone by forcing them to make certain choices. He talks about how that has happened in various different data-driven ways. By applying scrutiny, you can influence someone by having eyeballs on everything that they do, and you can influence someone, this is perhaps the most insidious one, by controlling their perceptions of what is true, by filtering and biasing what they are exposed to. And he says, look, these things are as old as politics itself, they're as old as humanity, we've been dealing with them ever since we acquired these brains that let us do language and stuff. But what's new is that digital technology gives them a potency that will far exceed any instrument of power. So thinking back and reflecting on the 20th century notion of the power of a state, the power of censorship, the power of propaganda, the power of markets, of marketing, of influence, all of these things are completely different in the world that we live now. I don't know. I'm in my late 30s. These things might seem absolutely straightforward to you, but I needed a book to get to grips with how the world has changed since I first became an adult. As a contrast, here's a quote from President Barack Obama in 2014, "We don't have a domestic spying program." Here is a chart of the number of phone call records stored by United States intelligence agencies every day. It's about, as of 2012, it was about 20 trillion records per day pulled across all these different databases with names like Fascia, DPS5, and Marina. This is records of who called whom, how long they called for, what kind of devices they were using. It's not, as far as we're aware, records of the audio, but it's every single thing about how you communicate with every person else. But of course, the United States does not have a domestic spying program. Okay, Cass, so we live in a terrifying cybernetic nightmare. We're all watched over by machines with all caps names like Prism and Traffic Thief and Karma Police, all real, by the way. What does that mean for me? How do I be a better designer? I can't change this world. What can I do about it? Well, let's come back onto firmer ground then. You and I perhaps are not likely to be the ones collecting mass data at the moment, though we do have to be aware of the ethical issues around its capture, but we are more likely going to be involved in how it is used. And we need to make sure that we are not accidentally or deliberately doing so unethically. There's quite a nice short book by Alberto Cairo, How Charts Lie. And some of this stuff is super obvious, like, you change the scale and suddenly the chart seems like there's a big difference or a little difference. But he outlines a couple of really simple points about how we can be more ethical. Cairo brings up this really interesting point, which is that in charts like this one that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, most people think that this means the storm is getting bigger. Most people think that the storm is, that big and it's going to get bigger and swallow Florida whole. Most people accidentally believe the wrong thing because charts and maths are complicated. This is not a dig on most people. This stuff's just hard, right? It actually says at the top of the page there, I don't know if you can read it, it says, note, the cone contains the probable path of the storm center, but does not show the size of the storm. Do you think that most people are going to understand that small text? Do you think most people are going to read that? Do you think most people will understand the phrase, the probable path of the storm center? No, it looks like it's getting bigger. So, what Cairo says boils down to, okay, not deliberately being evil, not deliberately tricking people is easy. Not accidentally tricking people is hard. And the only way that you can find out whether you've accidentally tricked people, like this, right? This is just straight up accidentally tricking someone into thinking that the storm is going to get bigger in a way that may have millions of dollars or lives in risk. Not accidentally tricking people is impossible. You just need to test. You need to do all the things that we're talking about for validating your visualization, and you need to listen when people are talking and not just say, oh, they didn't get it. You need to think, hey, hang on, am I actually accidentally misleading someone here? There is no way to avoid unintentional consequences. There will always be unknown unknowns. You can't prepare yourself for every way that people are going to misunderstand your data, but you can test, you can check. But most of all, the most important thing you need to do is remember those propagation techniques from the previous video. Remember glittering generalities and transfer and name calling and bandwagoning and the others that don't come immediately to mind. Plain folks. There's one more. You should watch the other video. I should apparently watch the other video. Remember those terms and figure out if you're using them as part of being persuasive. Trying to tell your story, trying to make a point is good, but if you dip your toe into trying to have an argument that is actually going further than your data can support, then you are probably tipping over into using glittering generalities or using name calling or using transfer. Or, and this I think is the most easy one to do with visualizations, trying to sow doubt. If you can get someone to doubt something, then you can get someone, if that starts getting reinforced, bandwagon effect by all the people around them, then you can hugely change people's mind. You can see this on the evolution of climate policy and perspectives towards climate action. And I think one of the best examples of this is the relationship between vaccines and autism. This is the chart from Andrew Wakefield's absolutely full of lies paper. Not just misinterpretation, not just cherry picking, absolute lies. The guy has been absolutely and conclusively debunked by the entire scientific community. There is no relationship between autism and vaccines. But if you look at this chart, it sure does look like there is this growing relationship between the number of people diagnosed with autism and the number of people who got the MMR vaccine. That's measles, mumps, and rubella. It's absolute and total horse shit. There is no relationship. I usually do not swear in these videos. But this gentleman, who you'll note I haven't cited, he does not deserve the credit. This gentleman has killed thousands of children since this was published in the 90s. He's a mass murderer. And we did it with this chart, this ugly low-res chart. He sowed the seed of doubt in people who, for entirely reasonable reasons, just didn't really understand what's going in these things. And a lot of the parents around them were saying that they didn't understand either. And it just seems like it's not settled, you know? And rates of autism are going up, right? People around you may be doubtful of vaccines. Hopefully not too many of the measles and mumps and rubella vaccine that has been one of the most effective things at saving children's lives that we've had in the last 40 years. But of other vaccines, there are perhaps very real risks, and especially as we start to deliver the coronavirus vaccine in larger numbers to more and more people. And I think it's important to note that when people talk about the risk of, say, blood clots in the AstraZeneca vaccine, that it is about 100 times less likely to cause blood clots than the pill. And we don't seem to have any trouble in making half of humanity take that for most of their adult lives. I intend to use these lectures next year if I can't think up a better way of doing it. And it may be by then that we've all discovered that one or more vaccines actually does have real risks, side effects that affect every 100,000 people or every million people. But it's also going to be extremely likely that huge numbers of people are fine, but were persuaded not to get the vaccine by charts like this one, by decades-long misinformation campaigns and misuse of data and bad visualizations. That's going to kill more kids. Anyway, you need to understand how to tell the difference between being as persuasive as you can with the data that you have and using the tricks of 20th century propaganda to sow the seeds of doubt and go beyond what you can support with the data that you have to just tricking the underinformed. Hopefully we'll be never in a position to make a decision like that, but I think we need to be prepared. That's all for this week, folks. See you in class.